History podcast for sleep. The sleeping customs of Berber tents in the Atlas Mountains, how Berber families arranged their sleeping corners in wind-swept tents, the shape of rest inside a nomadic Berber tent if you were to drift gently through the high Atlas Mountains of Morocco on a slow, dusty wind. You might stumble upon a cluster of low, brown tents blending seamlessly into the muted tones of the earth and sky. These are the homes of Berber nomads, or more accurately, Immerse peoples, the name they have used for centuries, long before the rest of the world labeled them otherwise. Their tents, which at first glance seem temporary and rough-spun, are in fact carefully crafted dwellings, full of tradition, strategy, and quiet ingenuity. Inside one of these tents, the air is dim and soft. The walls are made of woven goat hair fabric, naturally waterproof and surprisingly warm, stretched over wooden poles anchored into the hard-packed earth. These materials breathe with the seasons. In summer, the tent stays cooler than the open sun. In winter, it guards against the cold night air that slips through the mountain passes. But tonight, we're not interested in the fabric or the poles, or even the hearth where tea boils slowly over coals. Tonight, we are interested in the act of sleep, how, when, and where it happens. Sleep, for the Immerse, is not just something one does at the end of a long day. It is woven into the fabric of community, geography, and centuries of adaptation to both harsh terrain and social necessity. The first thing one notices upon entering a Berber tent is the way space is divided. These tents are not large, perhaps 3 meters wide and 7 meters long at most, and yet they are arranged with great care. There are no doors, no individual bedrooms, no locked trunks of personal space. Instead, the sleeping area is communal, but ordered. The family arranges their bedding each night according to age, gender, and custom. The farthest corner from the tent's entrance is typically reserved for the elder members of the family. It is the warmest and most protected spot, and this positioning reflects not only physical need, but social structure. Elders sleep here, surrounded by cushions and thick woolen blankets, often inherited or hand-woven with tribal symbols passed down across generations. These symbols, diamonds, zigzags, protective eyes, are said to bring peace to the sleeper. They are not merely decorative, but quietly functional in the spiritual sense. Next to the elders, the parents, and smallest, children sleep. Older children and young unmarried siblings typically sleep closer to the entrance. A practical placement that also carries quiet reminders of one's place within the tent hierarchy. Privacy is minimal, but modesty is maintained by sleeping under separate covers or cloaks. Before sleep, the tent may be rearranged slightly, carpets rolled out, pillows fluffed, fire embers damped with ash to keep the tent warm but safe. A deep, communal silence follows, punctuated only by the wind, or the occasional bleat of a goat just outside. Interestingly, the Amazigh do not sleep at set hours. Instead, sleep is adaptive, shaped by weather, work, and necessity. In the high summer, when temperatures are unbearable during the day, families may nap in short intervals and only lie down for a longer rest after the moon rises high. In winter, sleep stretches longer, encouraged by darkness and cold. In times of migration, when the tents are packed and the families move camp to follow pasture, rest becomes a collective endurance. People sleep in snatches, leaning against animals or wrapped in saddlebags. Sleep, in that sense, becomes an act of travel. Within the tent, the bedding itself carries quiet stories. Mattresses, if they exist, are nothing more than folded rugs or heavy blankets. These are layered atop ground mats made of reed, palm, or wool, depending on the family's resources and location. Some families favor using goat hair sacks filled with dry grasses or herbs. These herbs are not chosen randomly. Wormwood, too, discourage insects, rosemary for its scent, or lavender if available. Even the scent of the sleeping place is carefully considered. Light is sparse. In most cases, there are no lamps burning through the night. A small oil lamp might flicker briefly while children settle or tea is served, but it is extinguished before dreams take hold. The stars outside provide more than enough company. Their cold shimmer pressing gently through the tent's seams, one might wonder, what about the separation of men and women? Among traditional Amazigh families, the rules are subtle but understood. Married couples sleep together, often under a shared covering, but with space between them if elders or guests are nearby. Unmarried men may sleep outside in warmer months, under an open sky, or in separate tents if space allows. Modesty is achieved through custom more than partitions. There are even rituals associated with preparing for sleep. It is not uncommon for the head of the household to recite a quiet prayer or blessing aloud, calling on peace for the tent, the animals, and the neighboring clans. Children are often told stories, folk tales of mountain spirits, heroes, and wandering saints before settling down. These stories serve both as entertainment and as lessons, reinforcing moral codes, hospitality, customs, or the dangers of hubris. What is perhaps most fascinating is how the sleeping arrangement reflects the Amazigh concept of space. Space is fluid, negotiated daily, and built upon respect. The idea of fixed rooms or closed doors feels foreign. Everything is temporary, yet deeply rooted. A guest may arrive at night and be immediately offered a sleeping spot. Perhaps the host will shift themselves closer to the entrance to make room. Hospitality, even in sleep, is paramount. Still, one can't help but ask, how did these customs evolve? Were they born purely out of necessity, or are there older layers beneath fragments of rituals, symbols, or forgotten migrations that shaped how Amazigh families closed their eyes each night beneath the stars? Dreams among mountains, sleep, spirituality, and social rhythm in Berber life as we return to the wind-brushed canvas of a Berber tent. Nestled somewhere along a high ridge or valley pass in the Atlas Mountains, we begin to understand that sleep in Amazgh's life is more than rest. It is a rhythm tuned not only to nature, but to something older, an unspoken order passed through generations. And in this section, we begin to see how spiritual beliefs, cultural values, and seasonal realities converge beneath the quiet stillness of a Berber night. For the Amazigh, sleep is never quite an isolated act. It is deeply tied to the cycles of the moon, the shape of the day's labor, and the unseen world of spirits and ancestors. Many older Amazigh oral traditions suggest that dreams were once thought to be messages, not merely from the subconscious mind, but from Baraka, spiritual, blessing, or occasionally from ancestors who still watched from beyond the veil. While younger generations today might shrug this off, elders in the tent still sometimes wake and share a strange dream, cautiously interpreting it aloud over morning tea. This spiritual dimension of sleep carries over into the objects placed near the bedding. Some Amazigh families keep small protective amulets, often worn during the day and tucked near the head at night. These amulets may contain verses from the Quran or be wrapped in blue thread or silver to ward off the evil eye. Blue, particularly indigo, is considered a protective color, one that deflects unseen harm and invites calm. You might see a single bead stitched into a pillow or the edge of a blanket, unnoticed but meaningful. Berber oral poetry, often performed during gatherings or festivals, occasionally mentions dreams, but they are rarely simple or literal. Instead, they are metaphors wrapped in mountains, clouds, or fire. To dream of water may mean fertility or prosperity. To dream of a tent collapsing might be seen as a warning. Yet, in daily life, these interpretations are subtle. Few would panic. Instead, a dream might be quietly mentioned to an aunt or a grandmother and interpreted over couscous or during an afternoon rest. Sleep also reflects labor. In Amazigh societies, where herding and agriculture dominate. Sleep is balanced against the demands of livestock and weather. During certain seasons, particularly spring and autumn, sleep is interrupted by the needs of animals, lambing, milking, migration. Herds must be monitored even at night, especially when predators roam or bandits pass through distant valleys. In these cases, men and older boys may sleep in short bursts, posted near the livestock pens or high rocks used as lookout points. They wrap themselves in thick cloaks and lean against their staffs, eyes half closed, ears attuned to distant rustling. This sort of interrupted sleep is not treated as unusual. In fact, across many pastoral societies, from Berber tents to Mongolian gers or Kyrgyz yurts, fragmented sleep has been a norm for centuries. Modern notions of an uninterrupted 8-hour cycle would seem odd in this context. For the Immerse, a long nap in the heat of the afternoon or a quiet midnight tea with neighbors is part of the rhythm of existence. Sleep is not a block of time to be completed, but a thread woven between tasks and thoughts, even within the tent. Sleep may be adjusted to accommodate visitors. If a neighboring family arrives, perhaps delayed by weather or traveling through for trade, the tent becomes a site of rearrangement. Rugs are moved, food shared, sleeping spots offered without hesitation. This practice of generosity, timlilit, extends into the night. Hosts will sacrifice their comfort, even their warmth, to ensure the guest is well fed and rested. Children, too, are taught these values early. They grow up sleeping beside parents and siblings, absorbing the movements and stories of those around them. Even lullabies carry teachings. One common Berber lullaby, still sung in some regions, speaks of stars that watch kindly, goats that do not stray, and dreams that travel up the mountain to return with blessings. It is not about fantasy. It is about continuity, reassurance, and ROOTENESS. Let us not forget the matriarch's grandmothers, mothers, aunts, who often anchor the tent's social and spiritual life. Though soft-spoken, many of these women are guardians of memory. Correcting a child's sleeping posture, folding blankets just so, or whispering a proverb as they extinguish the oil lamp. Their quiet acts maintain the balance of the tent. If a child has a bad dream, it is usually the mother or grandmother who listens, who places a hand on the child's forehead and murmurs a prayer in Tachelhit, Tamazight, or Terafit, the languages of the Berber world. Interestingly, sleep is also a political act in Amazigh history. During colonial occupation by the French and Spanish in the 20th century, Berber resistance fighters often used nightfall as cover, hiding in caves, moving silently between camps, passing messages through families asleep in tents. Sleep became fragmented by necessity, and even silence turned strategic. The tent's appearance as a passive space masked its role in active resistance. Women especially played a crucial part, relaying information between clans, hosting secret gatherings at night under the guise of tea ceremonies. Today, as modernization spreads and more young Amaza move to towns and cities, the nature of sleep changes. Foam mattresses replace wool. Cell phones glow where once the oil lamp flickered. But in rural highland areas, these older patterns still hold. You may still find a grandmother whispering to her grandchild to sleep like the mountain still, solid and full of old stories. Yet a question lingers. How long will these patterns last? Can sleep traditions survive the pull of electricity, the pressures of school schedules, or the influence of Western concepts of rest? From sunset to sunrise, the changing tides of sleep in Berber tenses. The final embers of the hearth dim beneath a soft heap of ash, and the woolen walls of the tent begin to fade into night. One cannot help but reflect on the enduring nature of sleep in Berber life. But, like so many ancient rhythms, even the most grounded practices shift beneath the weight of time. In the early 20th century, anthropologists and colonial administrators ventured into the Atlas Mountains with notebooks and assumptions, often misinterpreting Amazigh sleep habits as signs of poverty or primitivism. What they failed to see or chose not to write down was the quiet sophistication of adaptation. How these nomadic families had perfected the art of rest under canvas, without walls, for centuries. This was not a lack of comfort, a harmony with environment, a balance between need and possibility. Still, the tent itself has begun to change. In many regions of Morocco and Algeria, the black wool tents woven from goat hair are becoming rarer. Synthetic materials are cheaper and more weather-resistant, though they lack the breathability and symbolism of the traditional weave. Families now may sleep under tarps or patched canvas purchased in markets, still arranged in the same traditional layout. Elders at the back, younger ones near the front, but the materials lack the same weight of memory. Electricity, too, alters the night. Some tents now run small solar panels or portable generators, powering light bulbs that hang from tent poles or charge mobile phones. While this helps in practical ways, light for childbirth, study, or night herding, it also stretches the waking hours. Children stay up later watching videos, and families may delay sleep to chat with distant relatives via messaging apps. The communal silence of the tent at night is occasionally punctured by the low glow of a screen. The concept of separate sleeping spaces is also starting to emerge in semi-settled communities. In some cases, Berber families now sleep in adobe or concrete homes during the winter and return to tents only in summer for transhumance, the seasonal movement of livestock. These winter homes often have rooms, doors, even beds raised from the ground. Yet the sleeping customs often carry over. Elders still claim the warmest corner. Children still curl up in groups, and bedding is still arranged with care rather than decoration. One important continuity is the Amazigh relationship to silence and darkness. In Berber cosmology and oral tradition, night is not something to fear. It is a time of reflection. Night, the ear hears better under the stars, or the silence of night brings back the voice of your grandmother. Even with modern light and sound creeping into tented life, this respect for night as a sacred threshold lingers. Sleep, then, remains something more than recovery. It is a form of return to family, to story, to stillness. And yet, the landscape itself is changing. The Atlas Mountains, long a barrier to rapid development, are now threaded with more roads and cell towers. Younger Amazigh often move to cities like Marrakesh, Rabi, or even abroad to France, Spain, or Canada. They return home during festivals or holidays, bringing with them suitcases, gadgets, and a new relationship to time and rest. Many of them find sleeping in the tent a shock at first, too cold, too crowded, too silent. But often, after a few nights, they rediscover its appeal. They wrap themselves in familiar wool blankets, listen to the wind thread its fingers through the seams, and remember what it is to sleep close to others, to drift off listening to a cousin's breath, a grandmother's humming, or a far-off dog barking at nothing at all. One woman, a teacher in Agadir, who returns to her family's tent each summer, described it this way: "In the city, I fall asleep alone in a quiet room. In the tent, I fall asleep with the stories of my people under my head." There is something profoundly human in that, the act of sleeping, not just as a physical need, but as a cultural memory. These tents, with their gently sloping frames and faded rugs, are not just shelters. They are containers of wisdom. Every sleeping corner is a lesson in modesty, hierarchy, intimacy, and belonging. And every wool pillow or folded blanket tells a story, not of conquest or empire, but of enduring rhythms, of knowing where your place is and being welcome in it. And yet, as modernization continues its slow but steady path through the Atlas, the question becomes more pressing. Can a tradition survive when its tools are changing? When synthetic tents replace woven goat hair, when LED lights outshine oil lamps, and when silence is drowned in Wi-Fi? Or will these sleeping customs evolve quietly, as they always have, not erased, but reshaped? The Berber tent has never been static. It has endured famine, colonization, drought, and displacement. It has held generations close through storm and celebration. Perhaps the sleep it shelters will endure too, not as a fossil of the past, but as a gentle, living thread woven into tomorrow. The monk who slept in 12-minute intervals to copy a single book, the clockless hours of Brother Aldrich, sleep in a medieval scriptorium. Myth you were to step into a stone monastery in northern France sometime in the early 12th century. You might not be greeted by the sound of chanting or the clang of a bell. Instead, you might hear a faint scratching, the soft, persistent scrape of quill against parchment. This was the sound of devotion, of transcription, and of time itself being copied into neat black letters in the heart of this monastery, Saint Pierre de Cluny. Or perhaps a smaller priory nearby lived a monk named Brother Aldrich. He was not famous. He did not lead a revolt or found an order. What makes Aldrich remarkable, if you can call it that, is that he spent over 30 years copying a single book. And he did it in 12-minute intervals scattered across decades between prayers, meals, and sleep. Or rather, what passed for sleep in his quiet, unchanging world. Medieval monastic life was structured around a sacred schedule called the horarium, a rigid division of the day into prayer, work, and rest. At the center of this schedule were the canonical hours, moments marked by bells, starting before dawn and ending deep into the night. These included matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The day did not belong to the monk. It belonged to God, divided into sacred appointments that waited for no one. Sleep in this world came only in fragments. The monks of Cluny were known for their discipline, rising as early as 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning for matins in the cold. Stone chapel, then sleeping again for a brief spell before prime at first light. They might rest after compline around 7 or 8 p.m., but only until they were summoned again. The night was not a single event. It was broken and parsed, sacred and practical. Like his peers, followed this rhythm without complaint. But unlike the monks who worked in the fields or tended to livestock, Aldrich was assigned to the scriptorium, the quietest, driest, and perhaps dullest room in the monastery. It was here that he sat day after day, year after year, working to copy a massive and rarely requested theological text, the Moralia in Job, a 35-volume commentary by Pope Gregory the Great. It was not an assignment of prestige. Few requested this book, and fewer still read it cover to cover. But Aldrich took it as his divine purpose. He wrote, not quickly, but perfectly, never a smudged letter, never a crooked line. His work became known not for speed, but for precision. And for this, he needed a different kind of sleep. Unable to find long periods for rest between the hours, Aldrich began a practice he never wrote about, but which later generations observed with quiet amusement. He slept in 12-minute bursts. Whenever his eyes drooped or his focus wavered, he would place his quill down, fold his arms across the desk, and sleep. Not for long, just long enough. Then he would awaken, say a quiet prayer, and resume copying. This polyphasic sleep pattern, though unnamed and unstudied at the time, became his normal. By spacing his rest across the 20 or more hours he worked each day, remained alert enough to avoid mistakes, yet never so rested that he risked oversleeping a prayer bell or disrupting the monastery's schedule. His fellow scribes teased him gently. The only man who dreams in Latin, they said, and perhaps he did. He never recorded his dreams, but he often hummed quietly as he worked, reciting half-finished sentences or muttering corrections to theological passages no one had requested. He was not eccentric, simply absorbed. Aldrich's desk was near the south-facing wall of the scriptorium, where light was best. He had a small ink pot made from a gourd, a goose-feather quill he reshaped weekly, and a lantern filled with sheep fat for cloudy days. His sleeping nest, if it could be called that, consisted of a thin mat of straw tucked beneath the table, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He never lay down fully. It was not permitted. Even his habits were slow. Before each 12-minute nap, Aldrich would rub his fingers with a pinch of sage leaves to keep them warm, stretch his back against the stone column behind him, and then fold into a gentle, silent sleep. He awoke without startle, without sound. No one ever saw him rouse with a gasp or stumble. It was as if he slipped in and out of the world between sentences. But was this healthy? It's difficult to say. Modern science suggests that polyphasic sleep can work under highly regimented circumstances. But Aldrich had no sleep manual, no sleep tracker. He had only his body and the steady sound of bells to guide him. He adapted not because he wished to, but because the structure of monastic life demanded it, and he found a way to copy his book while honoring every bell and prayer. After decades, visitors to the monastery began asking to see the monk who naps like a cat. Pilgrims found him endearing. A man so quiet, so slow, so consistent. He became a symbol not of brilliance, but of endurance. And his book, though rarely read, was considered a treasure simply because of the time poured into each letter. But how did he keep going? What made a man devote his life to a book no one requested in a room most avoided, sleeping in fragments and writing in silence? The theology of tiredness. Why a sleepy monk kept going in the minds of modern readers. Sleep deprivation and sacred devotion might not seem like natural companions, but for monks like Brother Aldrich, weariness was not an obstacle. It was a kind of offering. Fatigue was spiritual currency, a symbol of humility. The less he demanded of his body, the more he gave of his soul. The logic, while odd to us, was rooted in medieval theology. To deny the flesh, whether through fasting, silence, solitude, or lack of sleep, was to purify the spirit. Aldrich's commitment to fragmented rest wasn't just necessity. It was sacrifice. He may not have said it aloud, but each 12-minute nap served as both relief and a reminder. He lived for a purpose beyond comfort. In those centuries, monks were among the few people who truly lived without clocks. Time was told by bells, the sun, and the tolling of duties. The monastery's rhythm was built not around hours, but obligations. Even candlelight was rationed. One candle burned for prayers, another for reading. The scriptorium received the thinnest allowance. Wax was precious. So Aldrich, determined to avoid waste, adapted his vision to dim light, and sharpened his senses through repetition. He copied each word by sight and memory. Sometimes a novice would read aloud while he transcribed. Sometimes he worked in silence, repeating each word under his breath. It's said that Aldrich could recognize every page of the Moralia by touch. He knew where each crease belonged, which corner curled, which leaf had been repaired. The book became a friend, a slow, wordy, 1,000-page friend. Other monks would come and go. Some died early from illness. Others were transferred to different abbeys. Novices came in bright and idealistic, full of ambition, but most did not last. The cold, the silence, the tiny meals of barley and leeks it wore on them remained. He moved slowly, rarely spoke at length, and never once left the monastery walls. There were occasional disruptions, of course. A traveling bishop once demanded a faster pace in the scriptorium and suggested Aldrich work in longer shifts. He tried it for 2 days and made for small errors, each of which required scraping and repolishing the parchment with pumice. Afterward, he returned to his 12-minute naps. The bishop never visited again. But even in this life of repetition, there were moments of wonder. Aldrich once illuminated a single page, a margin around a verse from Job with a curled gold leaf, design of a sleeping lamb. It was his only artistic indulgence in the entire manuscript. No record survives of why he chose that page or that symbol. But some say it appeared right after a harsh winter, when half the monastery's sheep perished. Perhaps it was an act of quiet mourning. He also trained 1 or 2 novices over the years. He never insisted they copied his sleep schedule. Instead, he simply invited them to observe. "If the work is your prayer," he once whispered to a young scribe, "then rest must be like breathing between verses." One of his students tried the 12-minute method for a season, but gave it up when he fell asleep during sext and snored audibly in the chapel. Aldrich, of course, never snored. He breathed. Like a page-turning dot, as the years passed, the pages piled up, bound into folios, then quires, then volumes. The Morelia manuscript grew thick, heavy, and laced with Aldrich's habits. Some pages had faint marks where candle wax had spilled and been carefully scraped away. Others held fingerprints where he had pressed too hard in fatigue, smudging a letter and fixing it with tiny, precise strokes. There was no flourish, no signature, but his hand was unmistakable. Strangely, the abbot never reassigned him. Perhaps he saw in Aldrich a kind of sacred utility, a monk who caused no trouble, asked no favors, and filled the monastery library, 1 letter at a time. Or perhaps he simply knew that removing Aldrich from his desk would be like uprooting an old tree, technically possible, but not without damage. Even illness did not break Aldrich's rhythm. When he once caught a chest infection in the middle of winter, the infirmary nurse reported that he refused a bed. "I have my straw," he said. He coughed, he slept, he wrote. The intervals grew shorter to 8 minutes, then 6, but he still returned to the quill. He skipped only 2 prayers, then resumed them as soon as he could sit upright. It was only when his hands began to tremble that Aldrich considered stopping. By then, he had been writing for nearly 34 years. His eyesight had faded. He had to hold the page closer. But the book was nearly done. 34 volumes, copied, with just 1 left. He made no announcement, no final vow. He simply continued, nodding off for 12 minutes at a time. One morning, after Compline, the monks found him asleep at his desk. But when they nudged him gently, he did not wake. His head rested on a finished page, the last folio of the final volume. The ink was still wet. His fingers were stained. He had, as some said afterward, written his last word and slipped away between bells. The book, his life's work, was never widely read. It sits now in a university library, barely requested, rarely studied. But in its margins are tiny details, a flick of pen here, a faint smudge there, the trace of a man who believed every letter mattered. Even if no one ever read them, it leaves us with a quiet question. What does it mean to spend a lifetime writing what no one reads, and to do so joyfully without ever asking why? The theology of tiredness, why a sleepy monk kept going in the years after Brother Aldrich's quiet passing. The monastery continued on as before. The bells rang, the prayers were sung, and meals of thin broth and brown bread were served with predictable modesty. A new scribe took Aldrich's place at the wooden desk. Though not immediately, it stood vacant for several months, as if the wood itself needed to rest from the years of quiet wear. Some monks, newer to the order, referred to Aldrich's habits as eccentric, even obsessive. Why had he chosen that method? Why refuse longer sleep? Why cling to that rhythm year after year? To those who knew him best, the answer was simple. He never believed the work was about himself. Sleep was trimmed so that the manuscript could grow. Aldrich's Moralia in job manuscript was, of course, not the only one of its kind. Other copies existed in Toledo, in Cluny, even as far as Canterbury. Some were more ornate, with gilded illustrations and colorful capital letters, but none were copied as slowly, as deliberately, or as monastically as Aldrich's. His version became known, quietly and affectionately, as the sleepy copy. There is a page near the middle volume, 17, where the ink is slightly more faded and the lines tilt a fraction downward. Scholars believe this was written during one of Aldrich's deeper nap cycles, when he stirred just enough to write, but not enough to fully orient the page. There are no corrections. He let the letters drift. He trusted the drift dot in the margins. Of that same page is a faint note written in later years by a novice monk. The Latin is shaky, but the message is clear. This hand was steady through storms. That one phrase, nestled among Job's lamentations, tells us something enduring. Aldrich's life was not one of public acclaim or grand miracles. It was a life lived by candlelight and routine, by the dull ache of bent shoulders and the smell of ink-stained fingertips. Yet, in his quiet defiance of sleep, in his structured surrender to rest, he carved out a sacred rhythm, one that kept time with the bells, but never bowed to them. Interestingly, Aldrich's approach to sleep aligns, in an odd, unknowing way, with what modern researchers would now call polyphasic sleep. Historians of sleep have uncovered evidence that medieval people often didn't sleep in one long, unbroken block. Instead, they may have followed segmented patterns. A first sleep after dusk, waking again for prayer or quiet labor. Then a second sleep toward dawn. Aldrich took this natural rhythm and subdivided it even further, like a monk splitting tides into coins. His 12-minute cycles weren't just a personal eccentricity. They were a precise and humble response to a world that did not offer him leisure, but did offer him purpose. If his mind wandered too long in sleep, the text would suffer. The text, in his eyes, was the word made visible. It's easy now to dismiss that kind of devotion. In our age of digital backups, voice, dictation, and instant corrections, the idea of devoting decades to hand copying a single book seems quaint, even wasteful. But Aldrich did not see waste. He saw stewardship. Just as a gardener trims branches, not out of cruelty, but to protect the root, Aldrich trimmed his sleep to protect the word. What happened to the manuscript after his death is mostly a tale of slow travel. It remained at the monastery for centuries, stored in a wooden chest. During a period of war, it was briefly hidden behind a false wall. Later, in the 18th century, a collector of rare religious texts acquired it and donated it to a university library. For nearly 200 years, it sat in climate-controlled silence. One modern scholar, a doctoral student, notably insomniac, stumbled upon it while researching marginalia in medieval manuscripts. She wrote her entire thesis on Aldrich's unique handwriting, pointing out that his script was slightly more upright than the usual Carolingian minuscule. She theorized that his lack of long sleep affected his posture and thus his pen angle. It's the sort of claim only a true insomniac would notice. When asked why she focused on Aldrich's manuscript, she replied, "It was the only copy where I felt the scribe was still in the room. And in some ways, he is. The work remains. The wax smudges remain. The margins where Aldrich leaned his palm during tired hours, they remain. In a world full of noise and interruption, his pages offer a kind of silence that is almost tangible. It's a silence we can learn from, not one born of idleness, but of intention. A silence that says, even the dullest work, repeated patiently, may become a form of prayer. And even the sleepiest monk can leave behind something lasting, not because it dazzled, but because it endured. In the end, Brother Aldrich's theology wasn't about denial. It was about rhythm, about finding sacred meaning in repetition, in breath, in sleep, interrupted and resumed. He didn't conquer tiredness, he befriended it. He let it guide him, not distract him. In doing so, he offered a small, quiet model for how we might meet our own exhaustion, not with shame, but with reverence. And so we ask, softly, how many great things have been built not by energy, but by patience, not in waking bursts, but in sleepy hours, repeated faithfully until the work is done. Why Poseidon got jealous of a horse and built a salt fountain if you had wandered along the coast of Attica some 3,000 years ago, You might have come upon a rocky outcrop where sea winds tore through cypress trees and goats picked their way through brush without seeming to notice the ruins of something old, something forgotten. At the very edge of that outcrop stood a stone basin, irregular, crumbling, rimmed with salt crystals. From it, a faint trickle of briny water still spilled, pooling in a hollowed groove, and then running off toward the sea. Local shepherds might have told you a story about that basin. They would have pointed toward it with a nod and said, "That's where Poseidon struck the ground with his trident." And then, inevitably, they would add, with a smile barely suppressed, "Because of a horse." This is not one of the great epics. No war is fought. No kingdoms fall. It is instead a quieter story, a local legend about gods behaving with the pettiness of tired old men, about contests not of skill but of pride, and about how even divine jealousy can leave behind something as ordinary and enduring as a puddle of salt water. The story begins with a city that did not yet have a name. Back in the mythic age, that long stretch of time, when gods still walked the earth and every mountain had its own mood, there was a patch of land nestled between the hills of Attica and the Aegean Sea. It was fertile, temperate, and positioned so well for trade that it was almost doomed to cause arguments. Naturally, two gods claimed it. The first was Poseidon, god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses. He was known for his temper and his tidal beard for shaking the earth when crossed, and for creating horses from sea foam, a detail that still puzzles most scholars. The second was Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and handicrafts. Where Poseidon thundered, Athena schemed. Where he trampled, she planted. Both gods wanted the land. And so, in the way of Greek myths, a contest was arranged. The new city would be named for whichever god could give the better gift to its people. Poseidon went first. He stepped forward, struck his trident into the rocky earth, and from the fissure sprang, not a spring of fresh water as many hoped, but a churning pool of seawater. According to some tellings, it bubbled violently, spraying foam. Others say a single salt fountain emerged and trickled like an embarrassed sneeze. But all agree the water was briny, Ndrinkable. Still, it shimmered. It was dramatic, and for Poseidon, that counted dot. Next came Athena. She approached the same spot and knelt, placing a seed into the soil. With barely a whisper, the seed took root and grew into a full olive tree. It was said to be strong and generous, with silver-green leaves and fruit that could be pressed for oil. It offered nourishment, shade, and trade. The people, of course, chose Athena. The city was named Athens, and the olive tree was enshrined on the Acropolis. But Poseidon, god of crashing waves and terrible pride, was not pleased. And here, dear listener, we pause because the story, up to this point, is fairly well known. But what followed, the part about the horse, the salt fountain, and the peculiar acts of divine pettiness, is tucked away in later commentaries, forgotten footnotes, and local Attic lore that never quite made it into the mainstream. So, let's press deeper. After losing the contest, Poseidon stewed. Now, gods are not known for letting things go, and Poseidon, in particular, was not fond of defeat. What irked him wasn't just that he had lost. It was that he had lost to a tree. A tree. Athena had coaxed a leafy twig from the soil, and the people applauded. Meanwhile, his fountain of seawater, briny, yes, but symbolically magnificent, was dismissed as a failure. He muttered about it for centuries. But what stung more than the olive tree was what came next. You see, the people didn't just revere Athena. They celebrated her victory in plays, in festivals, in finely painted amphory. One especially elaborate vase depicted Poseidon in the act of giving his gift, but comically labeled it the salty puddle. Poseidon's embarrassment deepened. But the worst insult came when the people of Athens took the olive tree as their symbol, and, quite unintentionally, their love of horses, which Poseidon had also created, began to wane. Horses, once seen as divine creatures born from the sea, were now yoked to carts used in daily labor, or admired for their athletic grace during festivals. But rarely were they honored as sacred. And so, in a moment that can only be described as mythological sulking, Poseidon decided to build something strange. He returned to that outcrop by the sea, the very spot where his original trident strike had been made, and there, using godly force, reshaped the salt fountain, but not into a monument, nor a thunderous geyser. No, he shaped it into the outline of a horse's head. The basin itself was shallow, the edges rising in a gentle curve that resembled a horse's jaw. The trickle of water, barely audible, emerged from where the mouth might have been. No inscriptions, no thunder, no fanfare. Just a quiet, saline fountain shaped like the animal that Athena's city had learned to ignore. It was, in essence, a divine reminder. You forgot who gave you the horse. Over time, the salt crystallized on the basin's rim. Birds came to sip and recoiled. Goats sniffed and wandered on. But the shepherds remembered. They whispered the story to children embroidered it into lullabies. And long after the gods had receded from the mortal world, the salt fountain remained. And so we end this section not with triumph, but with a question. What does it say about a god or a person when their most lasting monument is not thunder or wrath, but a quiet pool shaped like a horse left to evaporate under the sun? Why Poseidon got jealous of a horse and built a salt fountain section to the salty shrine. The forgotten rituals and the people who remembered as the centuries passed, the myths of the gods grew faint. Athens expanded. Philosophers took the place of oracles, and marble replaced myth. But the little salt fountain on the rocky outcrop remained. No longer feared or revered, it became a curiosity, a relic of that strange in-between time when humans still believed the world could be shaped by divine tempers and equine tantrums. But even forgotten places have their caretakers. 1. The keepers of a sulking god's monument round the 6th century BCE. The people of Attica, especially those in the outer hills, still observed peculiar rites tied to the old gods. These weren't the grand rituals of the Acropolis or the civic festivals of the Panathenea. These were quieter customs, local and sometimes a little odd. Once a year, just as the first spring rains softened the soil, a small group of shepherds, fishermen, and olive pressers would gather near the salt fountain. They brought 3 things: a carved wooden horse, never larger than a loaf of bread, a sprig of olive leaf dipped in goat's milk, and a small loaf of barley bread soaked in seawater. They laid these items near the salt basin and recited a chant, not in high Homeric verse, but in an older dialect, half remembered, like a lullaby passed down through generations. It went something like, "To the one who shook the earth, to the maker of hooves. You who sulked and shaped salt, take this gift. Let the horses run, let the trees grow, and may your anger turn to foam." No temple marked the site. No priest officiated. It was simply tradition, a boring tradition, to be sure, but one taken seriously by those who worked the land and remembered. How thin the line was between myth and daily life. Point 2. The olive trees. Revenge and the whisper of seawater, the tension between Poseidon and Athena didn't end with a contest. It lingered in the way the natural world behaved around Athens. For instance, there were times during the height of summer when the olive trees nearest the coast would mysteriously stop producing fruit. Local farmers called it Poseidon's sulk. Likewise, certain springs in the area would suddenly turn brackish. Not always, and not permanently, but just often enough that people noticed. Even Thales of Miletus, one of the early philosophers who believed everything came from water, once visited Athens and was taken by surprise when a fresh water well near The Parthenon suddenly began tasting of the sea. He reportedly muttered, "It's just minerals," but his host replied, "It's just Poseidon." And so, even as the city embraced logic, geometry, and debate, a quiet superstition persisted. Salt in the well-meant Poseidon was displeased. And displeased Poseidon, as everyone knew, was bad for trade. Point 3. The clay tablets of the horse cult, much later. In the 4th century BCE, a series of curious clay tablets were found in the ruins of a storehouse near Piraeus, Athens' bustling port. These tablets, rarely discussed outside of classical archaeology circles, contained records of small offerings made to Hippos, Thalassios, the seahorse. But the seahorse wasn't an animal. It was a euphemism, a nickname for Poseidon. In his most temperamental form, the tablets listed routine donations: 1 amphora of fish oil for the fountain at Skyros, 2 garlands placed at the horse shrine, salted figs, 6 offered on midsummer's dawn. What's fascinating is that these weren't religious obligations. They were bureaucratic entries, ledgers, receipts, temple balance sheets. No grand narrative accompanied them. No dramatic rituals. Just line items in a quiet ledger, detailing the maintenance of a sulking god's little shrine. These records tell us something dull, but oddly beautiful, even when a god was no longer feared. He was still accommodated, not out of terror, but out of tradition, the habit of remembering. For salt in the soil and the gardeners who waited by the Roman period, batons, had changed hands many times. Emperors came and went, and the gods of Olympus were relegated to poetic devices, but the salt fountain, or what remained of it, still trickled. By this time, it was more of a curiosity. Roman visitors described it as an old Athenian joke, and some even threw coins into it for luck, mistaking it for a wishing well. But a small group of older women, mostly widows and herbalists, still tended the area. They were known locally as the salt gardeners. Every spring, they would prune the scraggly bushes near the fountain, collect the salt crusts, and scatter them around their herb gardens. They swore it brought vigor to time and kept slugs away from sage. When asked why they only used salt from that specific fountain, they would answer, "Poseidon made it. The sea remembers." They left no writings, but they passed their knowledge to granddaughters and apprentices. Even as Christianity swept through the region, some of their language persisted. One such phrase, "Don't salt the gods' wounds," became a common Attic proverb, meaning don't aggravate what's already tender. 5. The fountain that waited and the horse that wasn't a horse. The question that puzzled later antiquarians and bored university scribes was simple. Why a horse. Why did Poseidon, after losing to Athena's olive tree, choose to respond with a salt basin shaped like a horse? Some said it was because the horse had once been humanity's great gift, swifter than oxen, more noble than donkeys. Poseidon was reminding mortals of what they owed him. Others believed it was a kind of quiet mockery, Poseidon mocking himself. Perhaps, after all, what was a horse compared to a tree that fed generations? A salty basin versus a symbol of peace and prosperity. Maybe the god was admitting defeat. Or maybe, just maybe, he was suggesting that salt, too, sustains life. That brine preserves. That memory lingers in mineral dot. And so this section ends with another question, as it must, when even gods are forgotten, what is left behind? Is it their temples, or the way salt still tastes a little like memory? Why Poseidon got jealous of a horse and built a salt fountain from salty stones to silent myths. How a forgotten god found peace in evaporation by now. You followed a sulking sea god through olive groves, stone ledgers, and sleepy rituals. You've heard the hooves in the myths and the drip of brine in forgotten corners of Athens. But what happens to gods when even their most boring fountains are ignored? Do they vanish? Or do they simply wait, not in glory, but in the fine, crusted ring of salt left behind when the water dries? This is the final ripple in Poseidon's strange, equine legacy, where myth, memory, and the mundane all settle quietly. 1. The salt fountain in the age of sleepy scholars during the late Byzantine era. Most educated Athenians no longer spoke of Poseidon as anything other than a literary device. To mention him outside of Homer was like referencing a metaphor as if it were real. But there was one notable exception, a monk named Theophanes of Lorion, who wrote a peculiar treatise called On the Persistence of Divine Dampness. Theophanes was not particularly well known, even in his time. His writings were rambling, his observations overly detailed, and his conclusions vague. But in one footnote, buried in a chapter about natural springs, he described visiting a peculiar, brackish trickle near an outcrop where even the birds do not build nests, but sit and stare. He noted the salt residue formed an odd outline, shaped as if hooves had been pressed into stone. He recorded no miracles, no visions, only that the air there smelled of vanished pride, like a soldier polishing metals no one asks about anymore. No one preserved the site. No relics were stored. The fountain simply continued, a geological anomaly mistaken for divine punctuation. 2. When tourists replace pilgrims centuries later. When European travelers began poking around classical ruins during the so-called Grand Tour. A few curious gentlemen found the site. 1. Lord Pemberley of West Dunstshire, a very slow-moving antiquarian, documented it in his journal of my findings and mild indigestions in the Levant. He described a fountain as a cracked depression in the stone, where salt collects and no vegetation thrives. Locals call it Poseidon's Sulk. He tasted the water, because of course he did, and declared it quite unpalatable, but remarkably memorable. He noted no guards, no signs, no ceremony. Just a few children throwing pebbles into it and a shepherd's dog drinking from the edge. He added, with quintessentially bored flair, one assumes the god no longer minds. What a curious fate for a divine tantrum. Once a cosmic contest between gods, now reduced to a footnote in an aristocrat's travelogue, and a salty puddle barely noticed by goats. 3. The museum label that no one reads today. If you wander through certain rooms of the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, you might find a modest display titled Rituals of the Early Polis. Behind the glass is a small, weathered carving of a horse's head, made of limestone and heavily eroded by what scholars suspect was sea spray. The label reads, "Votive object associated with local Poseidon cult, believed to be linked to coastal rituals. Origin unknown, possibly from central Attica." That's it. No drama. No mention of the fountain. No deep dive into myths. Just a dusty plaque and a vague suggestion that someone, somewhere, thought a god deserved a horse, and yet the carving remains, because someone once carried it, because someone once shaped it, because someone once believed, deeply and boringly, that a briny horse could soothe a sea god's bruised pride. 4. Salt, memory, and the gods that learned to wait. There's a theory among certain folklorists that gods never die. They just evaporate, not with a bang, but like mist off warm stone, slowly, quietly, until only a residue is left. Poseidon didn't rage when he was forgotten. He didn't strike lightning or cause floods. He simply became salt, became a geological curiosity, became a whisper in the rituals of widows and the jokes of shepherds, and maybe that's enough. Maybe not all divine legacies need to end in temples or wars or heroic statues. Maybe some gods are satisfied with a basin of water that tastes like the sea, shaped vaguely like a horse, visited now and then by people who aren't entirely sure why they came, because even boredom can be a form of reverence. Even salt can tell. A story, Pinal Reflections, Poseidon's quiet legacy. So what did Poseidon really lose when he lost to Athena? He lost the city, yes, but he gained something stranger. He became the god of a place that never quite stopped remembering him, even if only in a sleepy, half-sincere way. Athena got the glory, temples, marble, priests, and praise. Poseidon got a weird little salt fountain, but he also got the stubborn memories of shepherds, olive farmers, and small children daring each other to taste the brine. He became boring and therefore immortal. And so the story ends not with thunder or waves, but with a final question. Is it better to be remembered as a statue or as a salty echo in the back of someone's throat, long after they've forgotten why they were thirsty in the first place?